Before I start this video, I have something kind of weird to say. Apologies if you can hear gunfire going on in the background. I don't live in a rough area. There's no like gang war or police stakeout or anything like that. It's just that a group of hunters have been probably after deer the whole entire day right behind my house. I keep waiting for them to stop, but occasionally I still hear them going off like it's nearly nightfall and they're still out there. So yeah, apologies for that. Don't panic, there's nothing bad going on. It's just a bunch of guys trying to get a deer for tea. So anyway, the other day I kind of lost my shit after reading a book called The Madwoman's Ball by Victoria Mass, and I got really angry with it because it did a very, very poor job of presenting in a comprehensible light the issues that women face in everyday life for the last 200 years by putting an element of fantasy, horror, seance-like nonsense in a book about Salpetre Mental Hospital, which is a real place where real things happened to real people. And it really irritated me because like putting such a supernatural element into a real world, real case, real place scenario just blew my mind. Like I lost my shit with that one. So I'm not going to go over that again, but it is absolutely possible to present a bring down the patriarchy, empower women, denounce wrongs towards women in society in a fantasy setting. And interestingly, I read 2 books in the same week that do just that, and I thought it was interesting because one of them I was very, very disappointed by. The other one I thought was absolutely brilliant. So I'll start with the one that I was disappointed by. This is When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. So this book is set in post-war USA, where over 600,000 women across the USA spontaneously dragon. Like they turn into dragons and just disappear. So this was during a time when the men and families of society were heavily dependent on what women brought to the household, the cooking, the cleaning, the raising children. Men didn't do that kind of thing back then, or if they did, it was kind of unusual. First few chapters of this novel, I was expecting an approach to be like the men of society, that are like the high-ranking men and the everyday men, having to face up to the issues of their wives not being there anymore and the massive void that this left in society. Like suddenly they had to learn how to cook and learn how to deal with the household, learn how to look after children. Or the children who would have been probably sent to the orphanage or to convent schools because their fathers just couldn't look after them and work at the same time. This happened to my mother-in-law. There was 6 sisters and their mother passed away during childbirth. They went to live in a convent because their father just couldn't work and look after them at the same time. So obviously this has a huge impact on a human being and society. That's not what happens in this novel. So that was a bit surprising. The attitude towards this is basically, this never happened. These women never existed. There are no such things as dragons. Let's just pretend that all of this did not exist. 600,000 plus women. Okay. So this is a huge problem at the beginning of the novel, especially for the main character, Alex, who is a child at this point, and she is witnessing this world and how it's kind of falling apart bit by bit. She starts off by seeing her elderly neighbour from across the road disappear one day, and the house gets boarded up and that's it, nothing more is said about it. She has questions, but the questions remain unanswered. Like nobody wants to address the situation, so in the end she learns not to ask questions and just accept this is how it is. Let's just pretend that this never happened. There was never an old lady across the street. You never went to get eggs from her. What are you talking about? Like, just pretend it didn't happen. Until her aunt's dragons and her aunt's daughter is brought into the family as her younger sister and not her cousin anymore, and her mother tells her, this is your sister, this has always been your sister, you never had an aunt, this is your sister, and everyone just accepts this. And this just is never addressed, which I find bizarre, but okay. The book is also supremely vague about why women turn into dragons at all. It's never really explained. At the beginning of the book, it's kind of hinted that they kind of snap. They can't deal with the horrors that they have to face in everyday life. They can't deal with the harassment. They can't deal with the patriarchy. They can't deal with their lives. They're tired, they're exhausted, they're angry, they're frustrated. At one point it gets overpowering, it becomes too much, and snap, they turn into a dragon and leave. The chapters are interspersed by theoretical and medical and scientific analysis by Dr. H.N. Gantz, who is the scientist who's trying to figure out why the dragonings happen in the first place. He gets kicked out of the university where he works, like nobody wants to deal with him because we're not supposed to talk about this. And he's like, no, maybe we should. And he's the only person who's trying to like ring the bell and say, this is a thing we need to talk about. He travels around and talks to dragons and tries to figure out why they turned into dragons, like what happened, what went on. He also gathers witness statements from people who have seen this happen. And this is one of them. He used to study, amongst other people, Alex's aunt, who used to be an aviatrix during the war. And obviously it was thought that like women can't possibly be in airplanes because something terrible happened to their anatomy. Like women can't ride, like it used to be thought that women couldn't do sport because it was bad for them, or they couldn't ride bicycles because it will make them infertile or something ridiculous like that. So this type of mentality was an issue at the time. So Dr. Gantz was supposed to study the effects of what flying a plane would have on women. And well, guess what? There weren't any to speak of. So this part here describes a woman transforming into a dragon because she was being harassed by some of the men she worked with. My research was only underway a month when, quite unexpectedly, one woman dragoned. A 19-year-old girl from Iowa named Stella. Her dragoning was fairly consistent with the other cases documented over the years by the WRC. By all accounts, she transformed in a state of rage. 4 airmen perished instantly. A 5th man, an older mechanic by the name of Cal, was the only witness. He said that he saw the men surround Stella. He called it hassling. He heard her yelling to be left alone and had headed towards her at a run, hoping to help. Instead, he heard her scream and saw her transform in a terrible burst of fire. The blast was strong. It blew him a full 20 feet backwards. The ground shook like they had been bombed. The men had been blown apart. It wasn't clear if either the transformation or the subsequent death of the airman was intentional. The mechanic did not believe so. When the dragon came to her senses, she noticed Cal staring at her. Wetting himself with fear, she patted his head and flew away. So the only indication we get of what is going on with Stella that led to her becoming enraged to the point that she turned into a dragon was her being hassled by 4 men. And this is what I really, really heavily dislike about this novel, is all of these cases, all of these scenarios, any time the harassment, the societal pressures, or anything that might lead to a woman being diminished in some way is extremely vague. Like, what was happening with these men? What were they saying to her? What were they doing? We don't know. It's just they were hassling her. They were standing around her. We don't know what they were saying. We don't know what they were doing. We don't know what they wanted. Like, what was going on? We don't know. And this extreme vagueness is what I think is just profoundly wrong with this novel. There's a lot of discussion between Alex's aunt and her mother about how her mother used to work in a bank and how she was very good with numbers. She was one of the star students at school, but she couldn't go on to be a mathematician or whatever because she was a woman. So yeah, just go and work as a secretary in a bank. But she was incredibly good at her job and made a lot of people a lot of money until she just got married to her husband, and that was it. And her husband, Alex's dad, absolutely believes that women shouldn't work. Why? He just does. There's arguments about this. There's a lot of frustration, especially from Alex's aunt, but her mother resents her aunt for not getting married and having a family and having babies. So eventually she does. So her aunt works as a mechanic in a garage. We learn later on that she's more interested in having a relationship with women. I think Stella was her girlfriend, and they actually meet her again at some point. Or was it Esther? I can't remember. But before her aunt dragons, she accepts to get married with this drunken random dude who also doesn't believe that women should work or have any kind of meaningful role in society, despite the fact that his wife is a mechanic. Like, why did you marry her if you don't agree with what she does? Like, okay. But they have an argument around a tea where it's like, oh yeah, well, women shouldn't do this, and that's it. It just stays there. Like, it just stays floating in the air. It's never addressed. It's never an issue. Like, why don't you do something about it? Because to me, her aunt turning into a dragon doesn't resolve the situation. Like, what does this do? Nothing in the novel. There's another character, this doctor, who comes to Alex's school to perform sex education, and he was one of the men who lost his wife during the mass dragoning. And apparently she left a note on the wall which said, "Thanks for nothing." But why? What was he doing to her? Why was she mad at him? Why did she leave? Again, there's just not even the beginning of an explanation, and I found that insanely frustrating. I think that if you are a woman reading this book, like, you kind of know, because we've all had bad relationships, like, we've all been harassed, we've all had this type of thing happening to us. So it's the kind of thing, like, if you know, you know. But what if you're a man and you want to try and understand? Like, what if you are, or even a woman who's never been through these types of situations? It's a really major problem with this novel. You need to give some kind of meaningful description. Help people who aren't in the loop, as it were, understand what the issue is. The issue is more than just women shouldn't work with numbers. It's more than women shouldn't be mechanics or shouldn't be aviatrix, or they should just be raising kids in the household. It's way, way bigger than that. This book vaguely scratches the surface, unfortunately. The other thing that I didn't like about this book is the main character, Alex, doesn't really go through anything up the high end of bad. Like, the worst thing that happens to her is her dad, when her mother passes away, her dad eventually remarries this woman and kicks out his two daughters because he just isn't interested in raising them. So this comes back to the issue of, like, fathers not knowing how to raise children on their own. Now, but his wife doesn't leave because she turns into a dragon. She leaves because she has an illness and she dies. So, okay. So Alex finds herself in a house or an apartment that her father pays for, and he's just like, well, go get married and have kids, and then you'll have a husband to support you and you won't need me anymore. But she's like, no, I want a job, I want an education. So she fights hard to raise money and also go to university at the same time and look after her younger sister, which is a difficult thing to do. But like I say, it's not up the high end of bad. It's not like she's on the street. She has a plan, she has a passion, she has a commitment, and she's willing to do what she needs to do to get it. And she also has an apartment that is paid for. So, like, it's not fun, but it's not up the high end of bad. And she doesn't really have to face any major adversity. The one thing in this book that I did like was her relationship with her sister, or her cousin, who becomes her sister. because she desperately wants to become a dragon. She desperately wants to take to her wings and fly away. And sometimes she kind of almost transforms, but Alex is always there to stop her and say, please don't leave me. Like, everyone's left me. My aunt is gone. My father kicked me out. My mother died. She has been abandoned by everyone. So, and her sister is really the last thing that she clings on to, the last person that she has left. Before the abandonment syndrome absolutely kicks in, she tries her hardest to cling on to her sister until eventually Dr. Gantz is like, maybe you should let her go, you know, this is her life, not yours. And she then has to go through, she doesn't even go through a grieving process. Like, again, the aspect of the whole abandonment issue is one that is always, like, means a lot to me, because I have abandonment syndrome and it's something that's really hard to deal with. It's also something that's quite complicated to get across on the written page. I thought Kelly Barnhill handled it pretty well. Her sister kind of always remains in this state of limbo. She can turn into a dragon but also turn back into a girl, which none of the other dragons appear to be able to do. Again, why? We don't know. But yeah, that's how it sort of remains. The last, I think, probably 50 to 100 pages of this novel I found really unnecessary. We get her finally going, like, the dragons come back, her aunt comes back with her girlfriend, and they make a house together and they all live together, and her sister gets to go to school and she gets to go to university, and it's all great and wonderful, but nothing much kind of happens. It's just like, this is what it's like to live in a house with some dragons who can knit. Wow. The other big thing that kind of frustrated me about this book is the dragons, when they come back, they start campaigning to have the right to vote and to have, you know, rights in society, to be able to live as people, as it were. And so there's protests and laws being passed and a bunch of stuff going on surrounding the dragons. What I find a bit odd about this is, like, what about the women that didn't turn into dragons? Like, how are they going to live? Are they allowed to vote? Are they allowed to, you know, have meaningful jobs? Is their place in society evolving in any way? Like, what about them? Like, it's not about the dragons, it's about the women. Surely. And I know it's metaphorical, I know, but still, it's I don't know, it's very strange to me. It's like the women get eclipsed by the dragons. Wow. I don't know. So yeah, this book was not what I was hoping for, unfortunately. It left me wanting in a lot of different ways. This book was listed by Book Riot as one of the best fantasy novels released in the last 10 years, along with Winter Song by S.J. Jones. Yeah, whoever wrote this article doesn't have the same taste as me. But yeah, When Women and Dragons by Kelly Barnhill abolished the patriarchy by replacing women with dragons. Sure. The second book I read is Iron Widow by Xiran Jay Zhao, which actually is one of the best books that at least I have read in the last 10 years. So this book is told from the point of view of Wu Zetian, not the actual Wu Zetian, but the sci-fi version. Wu Zetian lives in a society based on another planet where their human settlement is constantly under attack by robot-like aliens. To counter these attacks, her people have come up with a strategy. Build a massive great big wall. That sentence is now PTSD inducing. The second solution is to build massive, great big, mechanical, transforming, armor-plated machines that take two people to pilot them. If you've seen Pacific Rim, that's the idea. And these machines are known as chrysalises, and they all have a male pilot who needs a female co-pilot in order to power the machine, but the co-pilot inevitably ends up passing away, so sacrificing her life in the name of the conflict. Wu Zetian's older sister was one of these girls who ended up being chosen and having to sacrifice her life to the cause. And Wu Zetian is absolutely bent on finding the man, the pilot, who killed her sister and murdering him. So she ends up enrolling herself as a sacrifice, a concubine as they call them, and being selected by this man. So she plans to stab him with a hairpin. That's not what happens though. What actually happens is she takes over control of the chrysalis from him, and he's the one who gets left behind. Which earns her the name Iron Widow, because all the pilots have their names like Iron something, Iron Prince, Iron Warrior. But a woman who ends up taking control over her male counterpart is known as an Iron Widow. So there are precedents for this type of thing. So a heavily, heavily patriarchal society which expects women to just let go of their lives in order to help with the war effort. But before we even get to that, Wu Zetian's feet have been bound. The ancient mutilation form from China, where little girls' feet are broken, bent like in on themselves, and bound very tightly in dressings to stop them from growing. Because why not? So from the get-go, she has a disability which makes her incapable of walking properly. And this was done to her by the female members of her family. This was done by her grandma and with her mother's complete approval. The theory being, oh, well, we need to help each other to walk because we can't walk on our own. Like, yeah, this used to be a thing. I really like this because it really underlines how strongly the patriarchal roots go. Like, it's not just the men. Like, the men don't need to enforce their law on the women anymore because they just do it themselves. Like, they have accepted this way of life. There's nothing they can do about it, so they might as well go along with it to keep the peace, as it were. It becomes very apparent that her dad, who's very hot-blooded, that her mother really goes out of her way to try and calm him, to try and give him whatever he wants, make the situation better. And this is what happens within abusive relationships. Something that Kelly Barnhill didn't address is that that's what you end up doing. You end up just finding ways to avoid conflict at all costs, avoid making this person angry, avoid making them uncomfortable, and if they inevitably do become angry or upset or frustrated and start making a scene, try and put everything you can into effect to calm them down. And that's what her mother does. And the issue with that is it's just become second nature. It's something that you don't even think about anymore. And that comes across very well in Xiran Jay Zhao's writing. I assume the fear of a chi blast is the only thing preventing my father from storming out to make this uglier. Thank the skies, I'm wearing armour. A chill runs through me. My attention snaps back to the house. What misery is my father going to unleash once I leave? My mother and grandmother, I gasp, steering my wheelchair into motion. They definitely need to come with us, or my father will take it out on them the minute we're gone. Chuying whips around with me, hair bun wobbling above her pilot crown. You really think they'd be willing to leave on their own? Referring to her mother and grandmother. This scene here is great because she eventually, after becoming a pilot, she eventually returns to her family's home and confronts her family about this, and her father obviously doesn't take this well. She offers to help her mother and grandmother leave, but they won't. And as she leaves the house, this is what she thinks. I pause imagining how the conversation would go. I can't just leave. This is my home, my family. He's my husband. This is all they've ever known. Marry the husband picked out for them. Obey him, bear and raise his children. A lifetime of having their self hammered down until they can only take shape when fitted against a man. They wouldn't be able to detach without crumbling. All her writing is like this. It's so good because this is how the nucleus of the family functions. You can't have a woman without a man, but also you can't have a pilot for the chrysalis without a woman to sacrifice her life towards him. This is how metaphors work. Wu Zetian tries to find allies within the pilots' organization because there are chrysalists who have two partner pilots, so a man and a woman who doesn't die every time they go on a mission because her chi is so strong that she can work alongside the man to power the chrysalis. She kind of expects that the female pilots would like rally each other and support each other, but that is not at all what happens. As we've seen from her family and the foot binding, women only try and support the society that's already in place, the ruling patriarchy that's already in place. They support that. They won't support each other again to try and protect each other from it. In hindsight, I was a fool to have assumed Kielu would stand by me just because she's also female. It was my grandmother who crushed my feet in half. It was my mother who encouraged me and big sister to offer ourselves up as concubines so our brother could afford a future bride. It was always the village aunties who'd sit around gossiping about which girl hadn't been married off yet, despite complaining non-stop about their own husbands. And then they'd congratulate new mothers for being blessed to have a boy, despite being female themselves. How do you take the fight out of half the population and render them willing slaves? You tell them they're meant to do nothing but serve from the minute they're born. You tell them they're weak. You tell them they're prey. You tell them over and over until it's the only truth they're capable of living. And this is why Xiran Jay Zhao goes so much deeper into the problematics that women face than Kelly Barnhill because of these types of paragraphs. She is underlining how the notion of female fragility, of weakness, of dependence is bashed into you by everyone, everywhere you go. Society reminds you that you're a woman, you have no worth, you don't get to make decisions. And it is exhausting to have something relentlessly bashed upon you, even if you know that it's not true. And this is, again, how abusive relationships work. Like, this is an abusive relationship from half of an entire population onto the other half of its population. Men towards women. We want you to be like this, and we're going to bash you until you do what we want. And this is how abusive relationships work. You know it's wrong from the beginning. You disagree with it. You're like, no, I'm not going to do that. But the problem with the abusers is they never back down. They never, ever let it go. So they will continue bashing you. They will make sure you have nowhere to go, no friends that can help you, no family members that are attached to you. They will isolate you. And eventually you just become so exhausted that you'll just go along with it. You're like, sure, whatever. Well, you want me to cook and do the dishes and do everything in the house, even though you're just going to sit in front of the TV on your ass, and if I don't, I'll get a black eye. Okay, fine, I'll do it. And unfortunately, the thing about the family members being on board with this stuff is still a thing. Like, I used to be in an abusive relationship with my ex-boyfriend, and his mother and his sister and even his grandmother encouraged the abuse. They knew about the abuse, they encouraged it because they wanted to support their son, their brother, their grandson. And even as women in society, we are pitted against each other. Like, if a woman who sleeps around is a slut, is going to be judged as a slut by other women, even though they probably do the same or have done the same. And there's what's wrong with it? At core, nothing. But this is how we're taught to view each other, to judge, always being very judgmental. If a man cheats on his girlfriend, again, we are taught that it's not his fault, it's not the man's fault, it's never his fault, it's the woman's fault. She enticed him, she seduced him, whatever. It's her fault, catfight, you name it. So putting these responsibilities into the hands of other women makes them complicit, even though they are probably unwillingly complicit. It's still making them complicit and giving them the illusion that they are making these decisions for themselves, that they have a choice in the matter, even though they don't. There's another great scene that illustrates this really well, where Wu Zetian is being blackmailed by a really high member of society who is going to pay for her press exposure. But in return, he wants her to read out this contract while standing naked. So in the idea being that if she disrespects the contract or does something that he disagrees with, then he can show this to the public and say, oh, look at her being naked, and use this against her as a form of blackmail. Because supposedly she's going to be afraid of people seeing her naked. This is your choice, though, of course, he adds, releasing my shoulders and backing towards the side of the table. His fingers graze the tablecloth. Bullshit. Choice. As if there's a real choice. If I refused, he would use his money and resources to discredit me and Xiran instead. He's just trying to further humiliate me, bind me with the shame of having chosen this myself. Shame. My mind catches on the word. Is it really such a shameful thing to do? He'll have a video of me. What? Naked? Wow, the horror. As if I wasn't naked when I was born. My thoughts clear. I wrestle myself out of the pit of endless shame that my family has beaten into me all my life. And this scenario suddenly becomes hilarious. This silly man is trying to shame me with my own body. Speaking of which, I was at the gym the other day, and I don't really listen to pop music, but there was a video came up from Post Malone where there was a woman running like topless through a field and her top half was blurred. And this kind of thing just drives me insane, because like, were it a man running through a field with a bare chest, then that would be fine. You don't have to blur that. We can show men's chests, that's okay. But women's chests, no. Boobies, not good. Don't look at them, don't show them. For what reason exactly? Why? What's it gonna do? What's gonna happen? Do you think the world is gonna spontaneously combust? Like, what the quiche? So yeah, shaming us with our own bodies. Can't show boobies or the world will explode. I don't know. This book was such a pleasure to read, because Wu Zetian goes through every single setback, and she has a lot of rather horrendous setbacks in this book, unlike Alex from When Women Were Dragons. Like, she suffers through immense amounts of shit. She comes out on top as what is probably one of the most powerful people in her world, and she's basically won at the end, and she decides not to liberate the women or change society. She decides to become a tyrant leader, and I really like the way that this turns out, because this is like her version of snapping and turning into a dragon, because at the end she gets to pilot Chrysalis, which is an actual dragon. So this is like her version of that, only done right. So she snaps and she's like, you are gonna do what I say now, because I've done what you said my whole life and it's brought me nothing but misery. Now you can get to see what it's like. So she's extremely vengeful. She wants blood. She's risen to the top. Nobody can stand in her way, but she still gets slapped over the head by the gods, which I presume we'll learn more about in the sequel of this, which is called Heavenly Tyrant, which I mean, it's due out at some point in 2023, and I'm very much looking forward to it. But I really love that ending. Like, she gets to the end, she's won, she's the most powerful person, but she still gets slapped down because, oh, there's still someone above her that is going to control her, and she cannot ever win. So there's still this kind of mounting frustration, like how high do you need to go, how much do you need to fight, how many battles do you need to win before you can actually stop answering to somebody above you. So I adored this novel. I loved every word of it. I love Xiran Jay Zhao's writing style. She is very precise. She is very to the point. She is very, very good at describing scenarios. And even if you've never been through anything like this, even if you're a man and you don't know what women go through, you can't even start to imagine. This is very, very well written. It describes her emotions, her feelings, her setbacks, the pressures of society, the pressures of family, honour, everything. This is how you do it. Iron Widow by Xiran Jay Zhao. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me if you read these books, what you thought of them. Please let me know in the comment section. I really love getting feedback from these types of videos. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you all in the next one. Bye bye.